Second time, I call the member for Maitland.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I rise to speak on the Coal Mine Subsidence Compensation Bill. This bill has been tabled to repeal and replace the Mine Subsidence Compensation Act of 1961, and I note the contribution of the previous speakers on this issue. Previously, the Mine Subsidence Board administered the Mine Subsidence Compensation Fund, and under this Act, this bill, the Subsidence Advisory New South Wales will administer the Coal Mine Subsidence Compensation Fund. These are changes in names, but one would hope that they provide more certainty for residents of communities like mine in Maitland. This is an issue which has impacted very heavily on individuals within my electorate. Parts of East Maitland, Ashtonfield, Louth Park, Gillieston Heights and even Metford have all been in a mine subsidence district, and this has been an ongoing concern for those residents. Over time, most of the mines in Maitland have closed, although some do operate on the edges, and many of our community work in the mines. They understand the importance of mining to the community, but those individual properties have paid a huge price. In 2015, Kylie and Andrew Neal of Gillieston Heights were involved in an ongoing dispute over mine subsidence on their property. I spoke to Kylie about this earlier today, about the new legislation, and I just want to highlight for the House that this bill is something that will be really important to people like Kylie and Andrew and their family. They need certainty within mining areas, and it is good to see that this bill will provide some of that. According to the Maitland Mercury, at the height of their dispute, the Mine Subsidence Board had said to them that if a parcel of land is undermined, it doesn't mean that construction cannot take place. And in fact, many suburban areas are in subsidence district. And as I've said, this has created a huge cost to people in the community who have built there with or without their knowledge of the mining being there in the past. And we do know that mining has happened in the Hunter for such a long period of time that sometimes the maps of days of old are not as accurate as one would hope they would be. And so it's really important that while we know 90% of claims, according to the Minister, are for active mines, that 10% that relate to historical mines provides an even more precarious and more uncertain situation for those residents. For many landholders, I had one fellow, in fact, who spoke to me first about his concerns about flooding through his property 10 years ago, before I entered public life. And he spoke to me about his house. He showed me pictures. There was mould happening. He'd been to council. He'd been to Hunter Water. He'd been to all these different agencies trying to seek a solution for why his house was becoming this mouldy mess. He has raised his children in that house for 10 years, and he and his wife were just looking for answers. Thankfully, through the work that we were able to do in my electorate office, we were able to eventually get that to a resolution with the mine subsidence to assist him in setting the tone for that, setting the groundwork for that, of getting projects done and reports done that facilitated that entry. But for many residents, the ability to access the Mine Subsidence Board has been a real issue. And that is something that we have to address in this legislation. We need to ensure that the new agency does do that properly. The issue for the Neals in Gillieston Heights was that their home was not a designated mine subsidence zone. In fact, in 2015, the Mine Subsidence Board CEO, Jim Walker, said there are quite a number of mine subsidence districts proclaimed. The last one was declared in 2003, and he went on to say that areas not within a district, such as Gillieston Heights at the time, where it's been undermined years ago, can still ask the board for advice. And it is with some irony that Mrs Neal told me today that, of course, Gillieston Heights had been included in that in a recent declaration in 2016. And so this is the problem, that when properties weren't in a mine subsidence zone, there wasn't an automatic requirement of the council to approach the subsidence board when a development application was lodged, leaving them quite vulnerable to future damage to their property. Imagine, if you will, being the Neals, living with your children, small children, growing up. 10 years in a family is, half a generation. It's a whole education for some kids. To have the property damage from, say, a sinkhole, or even water or mould, or ongoing problems that you can never get to the bottom of in your house, would cause so much distress. This is not just a worry or a concern. This is something that impacts every day of their lives. And so for that reason, I note and very much echo the Shadow Minister's call for Part 2, Section 13, Clause 2A and 2B, to identify a timeframe for dealing with these claims. These are not claims that should be ongoing for a decade or more, because the stress and disruption that they cause to families is just unacceptable in this day and age. And for that reason, I'm hoping that with this new structure being part of the government, that they will actually ensure that there is an advocate for the community. And I think that's a positive step with the government, with the bill making provision for dispute resolution process free of charge within the Department of Finances, Services and Innovation, should either the claimant or the mine operator be dissatisfied with the original determination of Subsidence Advisory New South Wales and their expert panel, and that importantly, that dispute process doesn't interfere with someone's ability to go through the Land and Environment Court if they can't do it. But I think it is a really important thing to have not just an entry point, but a process for review and dispute of a decision. So I think that's really, really vital for that. That's really all I wanted to say about this bill, but just to really present that human face. The families that I've spoken to have been impacted by mine subsidence. It has, in some cases nearly destroyed their lives. It's a terrible thing to happen. It's a cost of the mining industry, which is being borne by small individuals, people like you and me, Mr. Temporary Speaker, who are just sitting there and living their lives, and suddenly they don't have half a house, or they've got water that seeps in there for years and years and years, and there's no answer for them. So I do note that the opposition is not opposing this bill, and I do hope that the Minister will address those issues around timeframes and also about properties, not just the actual constructed buildings, but as the Shadow Minister said, crops, fences, other property that has been something that those families have invested in their land to create, and yet, we're not sure that will be covered. So I hope that it will be, and that the Minister will define that in his second speech reply. Thank you.
The question is